Section 36 of the Boys' Book of Famous Rulers by Lydia Hoyt Farmer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laurie, Wehmeyer. The Boys' Book of Famous Rulers by Lydia Hoyt Farmer. Napoleon I, 1769 through 1821 A.D., Part 2. Republican France was now at peace with all the world, England alone excepted. The Directory raised an army for the invasion of England and gave Napoleon the command. Republicans all over Europe, England included, adored Napoleon as the great champion of popular rights. England trembled. It was necessary that the people should be taught to hate this man whom they now worshipped. The English press came to the rescue of the English government. The most malign and atrocious lies were published regarding Napoleon. He was represented as a demon in human form, a monster of profligacy and tyrannical ambition, a robber plundering the nations for his own selfish aggrandizement. Regarding these bitter and false libels, Napoleon said, "There is not one which will reach posterity. When I have been asked to cause answers to be written to them, I have uniformly replied, my victories and my works of public improvement are the only response which it becomes me to make. When there shall not be a trace of these libels to be found, the great monuments of utility which I have reared and the code of laws that I have formed will descend to the most remote ages, and future historians will avenge the wrongs done me by my contemporaries." Napoleon deeming an attack upon England too hazardous, the project was abandoned. Then followed Napoleon's expedition into Egypt. Volumes could be written upon each one of Napoleon's marvelous campaigns, but we can merely give a slight outline. The famous Battle of the Pyramids made Napoleon the undisputed conqueror of Egypt. "Soldiers," he exclaimed as he rode along the ranks, "from those summits 40 centuries contemplate your actions." The name of Napoleon became suddenly as renowned in Asia and Africa as it had previously become in Europe. But 21 days had elapsed since he landed in Alexandria, and now he was sovereign of Egypt. The Egyptians welcomed him as a friend and liberator. He disclaimed all sovereignty over Egypt and organized a government to be administered by the people themselves. In the meantime, Lord Nelson learned that the French had landed in Egypt. He immediately proceeded thither. The famous Battle of the Nile followed, in which the English were victorious. The French fleet had been destroyed, and Napoleon was cut off from Europe. All monarchical Europe rejoiced. All republican Europe mourned. Napoleon now undertook the Syrian expedition. With 10,000 men, he commenced his march over the desert. We cannot describe their weary march through the burning sands, their sufferings from want, and the dreadful plague which soon broke out in the army. We can only note the siege of Acre. The subjugation of this fortress would have made Napoleon master of Syria. Sir Sidney Smith conducted the defense with the combined English and Turkish troops. It was here that the marvelous affection of Napoleon's soldiers for their general was tested. Sir Sidney Smith circulated a proclamation, offering to convey every French soldier safely to France who would desert Napoleon. It is not known that a single man was false to Napoleon, whom all adored as a being seemingly more than mortal. The siege had continued for 60 days. Napoleon had lost 3,000 men by the sword and the plague. At this time, fresh Turkish troops arrived to join his enemies, and deeming the enterprise hopeless, Napoleon abandoned the siege. Napoleon was as great in defeat as in success. Speaking of his power to endure trials, he said, "Nature seems to have calculated that I should endure great reverses. She has given me a mind of marble. Thunder cannot ruffle it. The shaft merely glides along." At midnight on the 25th of July, 1799, Napoleon with 6,000 men arrived within sight of the camp of the Turks, upon the shores of the Bay of Aboukir. Napoleon knew that the Turks were awaiting the arrival of the Mameluke cavalry from Egypt and of reinforcements from Acre and other parts of Syria. Defeat to Napoleon now would have been utter ruin, but the terrific conflict which followed was not a defeat, but a victory so complete that the whole Turkish army was destroyed. Sir Sidney Smith fled in terror to his ships. Not a foe remained. In the enthusiasm of the moment, Kleber, who had just arrived with a division of 2,000 men for whom Napoleon had not waited, threw his arms around the neck of his adored chieftain, exclaiming, "Let me embrace you, my general. You are great as the universe." Napoleon now learned that France was in a terrible state of confusion. The imbecile government was despised. Plots, conspiracies, and assassinations filled the land. Napoleon determined to return to France. As he had no fleet, he could not take his army. The matter was therefore concealed from them. With a small retinue, Napoleon embarked and sailed to France. Then followed the overthrow of the Directory. France had tried republicanism, and the experiment had failed. The people were too ignorant to govern themselves. The next morning after the overthrow of the Directory, the three consuls, Napoleon, Cbteddy, and Ducos, met in the palace of the Luxembourg. There was but one armchair in the room. Napoleon had seated himself in it. Cbteddy exclaimed, "Gentlemen, who shall take the chair?" "Bonaparte, surely," said Ducos. "He already has it. He is the only man who can save us." "Very well, gentlemen," said Napoleon promptly. "Let us proceed to business." And important business he soon dispatched. The revolutionary tribunals had closed the churches and prohibited the observance of the Sabbath. Napoleon recalled the banished priests, opened the churches, and restored religious worship. The treasury was bankrupt. Napoleon replenished it. The army was starving and ragged. Napoleon addressed them with his thrilling words of sympathy and clothed and fed them. The navy was dilapidated. In every port in France, at the magic word of this magnetic man, the sound of the ship hammer was heard, and a fleet was prepared to send to Egypt to convey to France his soldiers left there. The Constitution was framed and adopted, and Napoleon was elected first consul of France. Civil war was now at an end. Napoleon wrote 2 letters, one to the King of England and the other to the Emperor of Germany, endeavoring to arrange a general peace. Austria was inclined to listen to this appeal, but England demanded war. She would have no peace while France continued a republic, so Napoleon was forced to prepare for war. Moreau was sent with a magnificent army into Swabia to drive back the Austrians towards their capital. Messina was appointed over the army of Italy, while Napoleon himself swept down from the heights of San Bernard upon the plains of Lombardy. At the fierce-fought Battle of Marengo he reconquered Italy, while Moreau chased the vanquished Austrians over the Danube. Victory everywhere perched on the French standards, and Austria was ready to agree to an armistice in order to recover from the disasters she had suffered. The slain at Montebello, around Genoa, on the plains of Marengo, in the Black Forest, and along the Danube are to be charged over to the British government, which refused peace in order to fight for the philanthropic purpose of giving security to governments. Austria, though crippled, let the armistice wear away, refusing to make a treaty because she was bound for 7 months longer to England. Bonaparte, in the meantime, was preparing to recommence hostilities. Finding himself unable to conclude a peace, he opened the campaign of Hohenlinden and sent MacDonald across the Splugen. Moreau's victorious march through Austria and the success of the operations in Italy soon brought Austria to terms, and the celebrated Peace of Lunéville of 1801 was signed. The energy and ability, and above all, the success of the first consul had now forced the continental powers to regard him with respect, and in some cases with sympathy, while England, by her imperious demands, had embroiled herself with all the northern powers of Europe. At length, a general peace was concluded at Amiens, and the world was at rest. Napoleon was now the idol of France. Although his title was only that of first consul, and France was nominally a republic, yet he was in reality the most powerful monarch in Europe. He ruled in the hearts of 40 millions of people. In 1803 the Peace of Amiens was broken, and all impartial historians admit, and even English writers cannot deny the responsibility of this rupture rests with England. In that treaty it was expressly stipulated that England should evacuate Egypt and Malta, while France was to evacuate Naples, Taranto, and the Roman states. Napoleon had fulfilled his part of the agreement within 2 months after the peace, but the English were still in Alexandria and Malta. Napoleon was right, and England was entirely wrong. If a violation of a solemn treaty is a just cause for war, Napoleon was free from blame. England now drew Russia into this new alliance, then Austria and Sweden. Prussia refused to join the alliance and sided with France. The bloody conflict began. For the slain left on the plains of Italy, for the tens of thousands strewn on the battlefield of Austerlitz, who is chargeable? Neither Napoleon nor France. Napier, in his Peninsular War, says, "Up to the Peace of Tilsit, the wars of France were essentially defensive. For the bloody contest that wasted the continent for so many years was not a struggle for preeminence between ambitious powers, nor for the political ascendancy of one or other nation. but a deadly conflict to determine whether aristocracy or democracy should predominate, whether equality or privilege should henceforth be the principle of European governments. But how much does this up to the Peace of Tilsit embrace? First, all of the first wars of the French Republic, the campaigns of 1792, 93, 94, 95, and the carnage and woe that made up their history. Second, 11 out of the 18 years of Bonaparte's career, the campaigns of 1796 in Italy and Germany, the battles of Montenotte, Millesimo, Dago, Lodi, Arcola, Castiglione, and Rivoli, the campaigns of 1797 and the bloody battlefields that marked their progress. It embraces the wars in Italy and Switzerland while Bonaparte was in Egypt, the campaign of Marengo and its carnage, the havoc around and in Genoa, the slain thousands that strewed the Black Forest and the banks of the Danube, where Moreau struggled so heroically, the campaign of Hohenlinden and its losses. And yet, this is but a fraction to what remains. This period takes in also the campaign of Austerlitz and its bloody battle, and the havoc the hand of war was making in Italy, the campaign of Jena and the fierce conflicts that accompanied it, the campaign of Eylau and the battles of Pultusk, Golymin, Heilsberg, crowned by the dreadful slaughter of Eylau, the campaigns of Friedland and Tilsit, and the multitudes they left on the plains of Europe. All these terrible campaigns with their immense slaughter does an English historian declare to be the result of a defensive war on the part of France, not merely a defense of territory, but of human rights against tyranny. Let Republicans ponder this before they adopt the sentiments of prejudiced historians and condemn as a monster the man who was toiling over battlefields to save his country from banded oppressors. The 2nd of December, 1804, dawned clear and cold. It was Sunday, and upon this day Napoleon was to be crowned emperor at the church of Notre Dame. All Paris assembled to witness this imposing ceremony. The church was draped in costly velvet of richest hues. At one end a gorgeous throne was erected. The emperor left the Tuileries in a splendid carriage whose sides were of glass, thus allowing his magnificent robes to be seen. He wore a golden laurel wreath upon his head. The acclamations of the immense crowds thronging the streets filled the air. As Napoleon entered the church, 500 musicians intoned a solemn chant. The Pope anointed the emperor and blessed the sword and the scepter. Then Napoleon lifted the crown and placed it upon his own head. Napoleon then took up the crown intended for the empress, and approaching Josephine as she knelt before him, he placed it tenderly upon her brow. Their eyes met for one moment in a long and loving gaze of mutual affection, and tears filled the eyes of the beautiful Josephine as she glanced with undisguised adoration upon the husband she so reverenced and worshipped, and the lofty arches of Notre Dame resounded with the shouts of Vive l'Empereur! The Cisalpine Republic had witnessed the change of France from a republic to an empire with great satisfaction. A deputation from Italy was now sent to Napoleon, begging him to assume the crown of Charlemagne. On the 20th of May, the coronation took place in the Cathedral of Milan. The ceremony was conducted with a magnificence not exceeded at Notre Dame. The iron crown of Charlemagne had reposed for 1,000 years in the church of Monza. The empress first appeared gorgeously dressed and glittering with jewels. Then Napoleon entered, arrayed in imperial robes with the diadem upon his brow and the scepter and crown of Charlemagne in his hands. He placed the crown upon his own head, saying solemnly, "God has given it to me. Woe to him who touches it." Meanwhile, hostilities had commenced in the midst of Germany. Austria and Russia had united with England. The Austrians had passed the Inn. Munich was invaded. War was inevitable. Then followed the campaign of Ulm. Napoleon writes to Josephine December 5, 1805. I have concluded a truce. The Russians have implored it. The victory of Austerlitz is the most illustrious of all which I have gained. We have taken 45 flags, 150 pieces of cannon, and 20 generals. More than 20,000 are slain. It is an awful spectacle. I have beaten the Russian and Austrian armies commanded by the two emperors. In 1806, England, Russia, and Prussia formed a new alliance against the French. Then followed the bloody battles of Jena and Auerstadt. On the 28th of October, Napoleon made a triumphal entry into Berlin and established himself in the king's palace. While there, he visited the tomb of Frederick the Great at Potsdam. The sword of the Prussian was suspended over his grave. Napoleon took it down, saying, I will send it to the governor of the Invalides. General Rapp ventured to reply, Were I in your place, I should not be willing to part with this sword. I should keep it for myself. Napoleon jestingly answered, Have I not then a sword of my own, Mr. Giver of Advice? The Prussian monarchy was destroyed upon the fields of Jena and Auerstadt. But England and Russia were yet clamorous for war. Again Napoleon tried to make overture for peace. Again he was repulsed. Then followed the terrible battlefield of Eylau. Amid winter's snow and ice and storms, this famous battle was won. As Napoleon passed over the gory field after the awful carnage, he exclaimed with deep emotion, To a father who loses his children, victory has no charms. A dragoon, dreadfully shattered and bleeding from the effects of a cannonball, raised his head from the bloody snow and faintly said, Turn your eyes this way, please, your majesty. I believe that I have got my death wound. I shall soon be in the other world, but no matter for that. Vive l'Empereur! Napoleon immediately dismounted from his horse and took the hand of the wounded man, telling his aides to carry him to the ambulance. Large tears rolled down the cheeks of the dying dragoon, as he fixed his eyes upon that loved face, fervently exclaiming, I only wish I had 1,000 lives to lay down for your majesty. Amidst a heap of dead, a feeble voice was heard crying, Vive l'Empereur! Half concealed beneath a tattered flag lay a young officer. As Napoleon approached, he raised himself upon his elbow, though pierced with numerous wounds, and faintly cried, God bless your majesty! Farewell, farewell! Oh, my poor mother! To dear France my last sigh! And falling back, was dead. Upon this dreadful battlefield, though it was after midnight, he wrote this fond note to Josephine. My love, there was a great battle yesterday. Victory remains with me, but I have lost many men. The loss of the enemy, still more considerable, does not console me. I write these 2 lines myself, though greatly fatigued, to tell you that I am well, and that I love you. Wholly thine, Napoleon. The Peace of Tilsit was finally concluded, and Napoleon returned to Paris. The French government at this time was composed of 3 houses, the Senate, the Tribunate, and the Legislature. Napoleon blended the Tribunate and the Legislature in one. He formed the Council of State, or Cabinet, with the greatest care, choosing the most able men in every department. The meetings of the council were held in the Palace of the Tuileries or at St. Cloud. The most perfect freedom of discussion prevailed in the council. In September 1808 occurred the memorable meeting of the emperors of Erfurt. Kings, princes, and courtiers came from all parts of Europe to witness the extraordinary spectacle. Napoleon was the gracious host who received them as his guests. No more gorgeous retinue had ever followed a monarch of the blood royal than surrounded the Emperor Napoleon as he left Paris for the appointed place of meeting. Amid all the royal magnificence which attended these imperial sovereigns, none appeared so majestic, so supremely commanding in their personal presence as Napoleon the plebeian monarch, who had raised himself by his own surprising and irresistible genius to the proudest place amidst the courts of Europe. All other sovereigns trembled before his amazing power. The imperialism of mind and genius compelled the homage of royal titles and royal blood. We do not uphold that Napoleon's career was free from error, and no greater blot tarnishes the brightness of his fame than his divorce of Josephine. From that moment Napoleon fell. From that moment, Josephine mounted an immense of self-sacrificing, unselfish devotion, of heart martyrdom never reached by woman before. Women have died for their husbands, but this was worse than death. Women have slaved and toiled and been downtrodden by brutal husbands, but this was worse than that. Never before had woman stepped from so high an immense of bliss into so deep an abyss of heart-desolating woe, and was self-renouncing, almost inconceivable, womanly devotion, allowed her royal place as wife to be taken by another, that thus a supposed political power might be gained by the idolized object of her affection, who, even though his cruel demand thus shattered her hopes, her heart, and her life, she was still unselfish enough to glory in her self-renunciatory sacrifice for the still adored object of her love. No political excuse can cover this crime committed by Napoleon at the instigation of Fouché and other ambitious adherents, and worst of all, at the instigation of his own relations, whom historians acknowledge were the bitter enemies of his wife. No laxity of the times in the sacred laws of marriage which are the most solemn vows that human beings can take upon themselves, next to their vows to God, can excuse this blot upon Napoleon's fame. By the very eminence of his genius above all other men, by the very exaltation of his lofty position, should he have made himself the model as an upholder, not a desecrator, of the most sacred human relation ever ordained by God. What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder, was a weightier obligation than any supposed political advantage, more binding than any patriotism, more incumbent upon him than any duty of state or country. No political reasons can palliate in the least degree this crime. They only weakly explain, but do not in any manner excuse it. That Napoleon, with his marvelous self-sufficiency of will and genius and wise forethought and keen-eyed intuition, could have been led into such a deplorable act, is past all comprehension. That it was the cruel and bitter mistake of his life he himself has acknowledged. Napoleon said afterwards, in separating myself from Josephine and in marrying Maria Louisa, I placed my foot upon an abyss which was covered with flowers. It was an abyss deep and awful, and from this dark and direful abyss issued forth the horrible reptiles of disappointment, sorrow, and remorse, which thrust their cruel fangs into the quivering heart of the lonely exile at St. Helena. Perchance in the silent anguish of his agonized but heroic soul a dumb wail broke forth. Ah, Josephine, my only love, bright star of my destiny, when I no longer gazed upward to thy heavenly light, but tempted by the demons of false counsel, followed in ignis fatuus o'er the treacherous quicksands of political ambition, then did I find myself engulfed in sorrows, and my heart was shrouded in the black darkness of a rayless night of hopeless despair. Had I been true to thee, perchance a just and righteous providence might have been more merciful to me. Thou wert my star of hope and love. Thou wert ordained by heaven, my star of destiny. Bitterly do I remember thy prophetic words upon that memorable night, when the tie which bound us together was shattered by my blind ambition. Bonaparte, behold that bright star, it is mine, and remember, to mine, not to thine, has sovereignty been promised. Separate, then, our fates, and your star fades. Ah, Josephine, you were right. It is to you alone that I owe the only few moments of happiness I have known in the world. Yes, Josephine was right. That hour marked the commencement of the downfall of Napoleon. His star, which once blazed forth in matchless splendor in the heavens, was soon to sink forever. The two greatest errors of Napoleon were the conquest of Spain and the invasion of Russia. The first was unjust, the second was unfortunate. We can but give one picture of the Russian campaign. Napoleon and his army had marched in triumph more than 2,000 miles from his capital. Victory had accompanied him. He had taken the metropolis of the most powerful nation on the continent, though that nation had been aided by England, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden. Moscow was in the possession of the French. Napoleon was established in the Kremlin. It was the 16th of September, 1812. At midnight, the cry of "Fire!" resounded through the streets. Moscow was in flames. Mines were sprung, shells burst, cannons were discharged, wagons of powder exploded. Earthquake succeeded earthquake. Volcano followed volcano of flame and smoke and burning projectiles, until the whole vast city was wrapped in one wild ocean of flame. Napoleon said of this awful sight, "It was a spectacle of a sea and billows of fire, a sky and clouds of flame, mountains of red rolling flames like immense waves of the sea, alternately bursting forth and elevating themselves to skies of fire, and then sinking into the ocean of flame below. Oh, it was the most grand, the most sublime, the most terrific sight the world ever beheld." Nothing was left of Moscow save the remembrance of its former grandeur. Then followed the terrible retreat of the French army through the cold and snow and winter storms. During this unfortunate expedition, the entire army of Napoleon had been destroyed. During the Russian campaign, France is believed to have lost about 350,000 soldiers. 100,000 were killed in the advance and retreat. 150,000 died from hunger, fatigue, and the severity of the climate, and about 100,000 remained prisoners in the hands of the Russians, not more than half of whom ever returned to France. Still, notwithstanding the enormous wars in which Napoleon had been engaged, he had expended in works of public improvement for the embellishment of France, in the course of 9 years, more than $200 millions. These miracles, said a French writer, were all effected by steadiness of purpose, talent armed with power, and finances wisely and economically applied. If a man of the age of the Medici or of Louis XIV were to revisit the earth, and at the sight of so many marvels ask how many ages of peace and glorious reigns had been required to produce them, he would be answered, 12 years of war and a single man. But the war was not over. With an army formed of fresh recruits, again Napoleon was forced to meet his foes. Then followed the Battle of Lutzen, which is regarded as one of the most brilliant proofs of Napoleon's genius. But now many a Judas appeared in the midst of his supposed friends. General Jomini deserted the staff of Marshal Ney and went over to the Emperor Alexander. Bernadotte of Sweden took up arms against the French, and General Moreau went over to the camp of the Allies. After the disaster of Leipzig and the losses sustained by different divisions of the army in that campaign, and the mortality which thinned so dreadfully the French armies on the Rhine, France felt herself exhausted and weak. In this depressed state, the civilized world was preparing its last united onset upon her. From the Baltic to the Bosphorus, from the Archangel to the Mediterranean, Europe had banded itself against Napoleon. Denmark and Sweden had struck hands with Austria and Russia and Prussia and England, while, to crown all, the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine put their signatures to the League, and 1,028,000 men stood up in battle array on the plains of Europe to overthrow this mighty spirit that had shaken so terribly their thrones. And all this resistless host were pointing their bayonets towards Paris. What man or nation could meet such an overwhelming foe? Never did Napoleon's genius shine forth with greater splendor than in the almost superhuman exertions he put forth in this last great struggle for his empire. The Allies entered the capital, and Napoleon was compelled to abdicate, preferring exile rather than involve France in more terrible bloodshed. He then penned this memorable abdication. The Allied sovereigns have declared that the Emperor Napoleon is the sole obstacle to the re-establishment of a general peace in Europe. The Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and his heirs the throne of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, not even that of life itself, which he is not willing to make for the interests of France. End of section 36. Section 37 of The Boy's Book of Famous Rulers by Lydia Hoyt Farmer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laurie, Wehmeyer. The Boy's Book of Famous Rulers by Lydia Hoyt Farmer. Napoleon I, 1769 through 1821 A.D. Part 3. Then followed his mournful farewell to his soldiers. As Napoleon arrived at the landing of the grand staircase, he stood for a moment and looked around upon the guard drawn up in the court, and upon the innumerable multitude which thronged its surroundings. Every eye was fixed on him. It was a funereal scene, over which was suspended the solemnity of religious awe. Acclamations in that hour would have been a mockery. The silence of the grave reigned undisturbed. Tears rolled down the furrowed cheeks of the warriors, and their heads were bowed in overwhelming grief. Napoleon cast a tender and grateful look over the battalions and the squadrons who had ever proved so faithful to himself and to his cause. Before descending to the courtyard, he hesitated for a moment, as if his fortitude were forsaking him. But immediately rallying his strength, he approached the soldiers. The drums commenced beating the accustomed salute. With a gesture, Napoleon arrested the martial tones. A breathless stillness prevailed, with a voice clear and firm, every articulation of which was heard in the remotest ranks. He said, "Generals, officers, and soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 25 years I have ever found you in the path of honor and of glory. In these last days, as in the days of our prosperity, you have never ceased to be models of fidelity and of courage. Europe has armed against us. Still, with men such as you, our cause never could have been lost. We could have maintained a civil war for years, but it would have rendered our country unhappy. I have therefore sacrificed our interests to those of France. I leave you, but my friends, be faithful to the new sovereign whom France has accepted. The happiness of France was my only thought. It shall ever be the object of my most fervent prayers. Grieve not for my lot. I shall be happy so long as I know that you are so. If I have consented to outlive myself, it is with the hope of still promoting your glory. I trust to write the deeds we have achieved together. Adieu, my children. I would that I could press you all to my heart. Let me at least embrace your general and your eagle. Every eye was now bathed in tears. At a signal from Napoleon, General Petit, who then commanded the Old Guard, advanced and stood between the ranks of the soldiers and their emperor. Napoleon, with tears dimming his eyes, encircled the general in his arms, while the veteran commander, entirely unmanned, sobbed aloud. All hearts were melted, and a stilled moan was heard through all the ranks. Again the emperor recovered himself and said, "Bring me the eagle." A grenadier advanced, bearing one of the eagles of the regiment. Napoleon imprinted a kiss upon its silver beak, then pressed the eagle to his heart, and said in tremulous accents, "Dear eagle, may this last embrace vibrate forever in the hearts of all my faithful soldiers. Farewell again, my old companions. Farewell." But Elba could not long hold that daring, restless spirit. The next year he again unrolled his standard in the capital of France, and the army opened its arms to receive him. He at length staked all on the field of Waterloo. There the star of his destiny again rose over the horizon, and struggled with its ancient strength to mount the heavens of fame. The battle cloud rolled over it, and when it again was swept away, the star had gone down, sunk in blood and carnage, to rise no more forever. Volumes have been written on this campaign and last battle, but every impartial mind must come to the same conclusion, that Napoleon's plans never promised more complete success than at this last effort. Wellington was entrapped, and with the same cooperation on both sides, he was lost beyond redemption. Had Blücher stayed away as Grouchy did, or had Grouchy come up as did Blücher, victory would once more have soared with the French eagles. It is in vain to talk of Grouchy's having obeyed orders. It was plainly his duty, and his only duty, to detain Blücher or to follow him. Even yet, Napoleon could have placed himself at the head of 50,000 men in a few hours. He was entreated by his friends to grasp these powerful resources and again attack the foe. But treachery had already invaded the Chamber of Deputies. The wily Fouché, the same who had largely instigated the divorce of Josephine, had obtained the control, and joining with the Bourbons, persuaded the Chamber to demand the second abdication of the emperor. 2 regiments of volunteers from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, accompanied by a countless multitude, marched to the gates of the Élysée. A deputation waited upon the emperor, stating that the traitorous Chamber of Deputies was about to sell France again to the Bourbons, and entreating him to take the reins of government into his own hands, as on the 18th Brumaire. The emperor replied, "You recall to my remembrance the 18th Brumaire, but you forget that the circumstances are not the same. On the 18th Brumaire the nation was unanimous in desiring a change. A feeble effort only was necessary to effect what they so much desired. Now it would require floods of French blood, and never shall a single drop be shed by me in defense of a cause purely personal. Putting the brute force of the mass of the people into action would doubtless save Paris, and ensure me the crown without incurring the horrors of civil war. But it would likewise be risking thousands of French lives. No, I like the regrets of France better than her crown." And so Napoleon, sacrificing himself to save the lives of the French people, dictated his second act of abdication and resigned himself with amazing calmness to this overwhelming disaster. But when he threw himself upon the generosity of England, she treacherously entrapped him on the Bellerophon, and afterwards conveyed him as a captive to the desolate island of St. Helena, where she set spies over him to torture and insult him, and gloated with demoniacal cruelty over the reports they gave of his sufferings. But England, with all her cunning and her base treachery, could not imprison the matchless mind and soul of the great Napoleon. Though his body was chained to a dreary rock prison, his genius was still the royal emperor of the world. His wondrous sayings at St. Helena have become the textbooks for the students of all climes. An English writer who holds the position of a professor in the University of Cambridge, in a work lately published, thus gives to Napoleon his place in history. There are times, and these are the most usual, when the most wonderful abilities would not have availed to raise any man from such a station as that in which Napoleon was borne to the head of affairs. But the last years of the 18th century formed an exceptional period, in which such an ascent was not only possible in France, but was quite possible without very extraordinary abilities. That particular part of Napoleon's career to which the Alexanders and Hannibals can show nothing parallel is, in fact, just the part which, in that exceptional time, was within the reach of an ordinary man. Thus the miracle of Bonaparte's rise to power lies not so much in his personality as in the time. What a pity that this English professor could not have happened to have lived when ordinary men might have become so great. One great secret of Napoleon's success was the union of two striking qualities which are not often found together. His imagination was as ardent, and his mind as impetuous as the most rash warrior. At the same time his judgment was as cool and correct as the ablest tactician. His mind moved with the rapidity of lightning, and yet with the precision and steadiness of naked reason. This power of thinking quick and thinking right is one of the rarest and yet most important qualities to ensure success. As a military leader, he has no superior in ancient or modern times. Instead of following what was then considered the scientific mode of warfare, he fell back upon his own genius and originated tactics which filled his foes with horrified surprise. His power of combination was unequaled, his mind seemed vast enough for the management of the globe, and yet so perfect was the system and arrangement of his plans and thoughts that the slightest detail was never overlooked. His bravery amounted to rashness where his own life was concerned. He feared neither shot nor shell, and carelessly exposed himself whenever he thought his presence was needed, replying to his soldiers, who often besought him not to risk his life so recklessly, "Courage! The bullet that is to kill me is not yet cast." As a thinker and statesman, Napoleon was as remarkable as he was as a politician and general. His genius was universal. Had he not been a Napoleon, he might have been a Shakespeare or a Bacon. He condensed a volume into a sentence. His words were as keen as the blade of a Damascus sword, and as freighted with ominous meaning as the tides of the ocean. He knew men. He knew books. He knew nature. In 25 lessons, Napoleon became so familiar with the English language that he could read any English book without difficulty. Another remarkable trait in Napoleon was his self-sufficiency. That self-confidence, which in smaller men would have been mad folly, was in him the most far-seeing wisdom. He needed no opinions of other men to govern his actions. He was sufficient unto himself. He took counsel only of his own genius and reason and marvelous intuitions. His self-reliance was his power in the midst of danger and difficulties. He believed God had given him a great part to play in the world's drama, and he meant to play it well. His plans were almost the inspiration of prophetic foreknowledge. Napoleon was also the greatest of statesmen. His conversations at St. Helena display his wonderful knowledge of men and governments and laws and administrative legislation. Nowhere else can be found such profound thoughts upon politics, war, sciences, art, or religion. He has been accused of infidelity, but few declarations of the divinity of Christ ever uttered by mortal lips have equaled in far-reaching apprehension and also acknowledgment of the divine incomprehensibility of the mystery of the Godhead, as the sayings of Napoleon. Conversing with General Bertrand at St. Helena, Napoleon said, "I know men, and I tell you that Jesus Christ is not a man. Superficial minds see a resemblance between Christ and the founders of empires, and the gods of other religions. That resemblance does not exist. There is between Christianity and all other religions whatsoever the distance of infinity. Paganism was never accepted as truth by the wise men of Greece, neither by Socrates, Pythagoras, Plato, Anaxagoras, nor Pericles. But on the other side, the loftiest intellect since the advent of Christianity have had faith, a living faith, a practical faith, in the mysteries and doctrines of the gospel. Paganism is the work of man. What do these gods so boastful know more than other mortals? These legislators, Greek or Roman, these Pneuma, these Lycurgus, these priests of India or of Memphis, this Confucius, this Mohammed, absolutely nothing. They have made a perfect chaos of morals. There is not one among them all who has said anything new in reference to our future destiny, to the soul, to the essence of God, to the creation. As for me, I recognize the gods and these great men as beings like myself. They have performed a lofty part in their times, as I have done. Nothing announces them divine. On the contrary, there are numerous resemblances between them and myself, foibles and errors, which ally them to me and to humanity. It is not so with Christ. Everything in him astonishes me. His spirit overawes me, and his will confounds me. Between him and whoever else in the world there is no possible term of comparison. His birth, and the history of his life, the profundity of his doctrine, which grapples the mightiest difficulties, and which is of those difficulties the most admirable solution, his gospel, his apparition, his empire, his march across the ages and the realms, everything is to me a prodigy, an insoluble mystery, which plunges me into a reverie from which I cannot escape, a mystery which is there before my eyes, a mystery which I can neither deny nor explain. Here I see nothing human. Jesus borrowed nothing from our sciences. His religion is a revelation from an intelligence which certainly is not that of man. One can absolutely find nowhere, but in him alone, the imitation or the example of his life. He is not a philosopher, since he advances by miracles, and from the first his disciples worshipped him. He persuades them far more by an appeal to the heart than by any display of method and of logic. Neither did he impose upon them any preliminary studies or any knowledge of letters. All his religion consists in believing. In fact, the sciences and philosophy avail nothing for salvation. He has nothing to do but with the soul, and to that alone he brings his gospel. The soul is sufficient for him, as he is sufficient for the soul. I search in vain in history to find a parallel to Jesus Christ, or anything which can approach the gospel. Neither history, nor humanity, nor the ages, nor nature can offer me anything with which I am able to compare it or explain it. The more I consider the gospel, the more I am assured that there is nothing there which is not beyond the march of events, and above the human mind. You speak of Caesar, of Alexander, of their conquests, and of the enthusiasm they enkindled in the hearts of their soldiers. But can you conceive of a dead man making conquests, with an army faithful and entirely devoted to his memory? My armies have forgotten me, even while living, as the Carthaginian army forgot Hannibal. Such is our power. A single battle lost crushes us, and adversity scatters our friends. Can you conceive of Caesar, the eternal emperor of the Roman Senate, from the depths of his mausoleum governing the empire, watching over the destinies of Rome? Such is the history of the invasion and conquest of the world by Christianity. Such is the power of the God of the Christians, and such is the perpetual miracle of the progress of the faith and of the government of his church. Nations pass away, thrones crumble, but the church remains. In every other existence but that of Christ, how many imperfections! From the first day to the last he is the same, always the same, majestic and simple, infinitely firm and infinitely gentle. Christ proved that he was the Son of the Eternal by his disregard of time. All his doctrines signify one and the same thing: eternity. The gospel is not a book. It is a living being with an action, a power which invades everything that opposes its extension. Behold it upon this table, this book surpassing all others. Here he solemnly placed his hand upon it. I never omit to read it, and every day with the same pleasure. Nowhere is to be found such a series of beautiful ideas, admirable moral maxims, which defile like the battalions of a celestial army, and which produce in our soul the same emotion which one experiences in contemplating the infinite expanse of the skies, resplendent in a summer's night, with all the brilliance of the stars. Not only is our mind absorbed, it is controlled, and the soul can never go astray with this book for its guide. Once master of our spirit, the faithful gospel loves us. God even is our friend, our Father, and truly our God. What a proof of the divinity of Christ! With an empire so absolute, he has but one single end, the spiritual amelioration of individuals, the purity of conscience, the union to that which is true, the holiness of the soul, so that Christ's greatest miracle undoubtedly is the reign of charity. Behold the destiny near at hand of him who has been called the great Napoleon. What an abyss between my deep misery and the eternal reign of Christ, which is proclaimed, loved, adored, and which is extending over all the earth. Is this to die? Is it not rather to live? The death of Christ, it is the death of God. Turning to General Bertrand, if you do not perceive that Jesus Christ is God, very well, then I did wrong to make you a general. At length came the last, though to Napoleon most welcome summons. A few days before his death, he awoke one morning, saying, I have just seen my good Josephine, but she would not embrace me. She disappeared at the moment when I was about to take her in my arms. She was seated there. It seemed to me that I had seen her yesterday evening. She is not changed. She is still the same, full of devotion to me. She told me that we were about to see each other again, never more to part. The disease progressed rapidly, and the dying hour drew near. It was the month of May, 1821. A violent storm raged with wild fury on that rocky prison isle, as the spirit of the great Napoleon was freeing itself from its earthly fetters. His few faithful friends who shared his exile stood weeping around his couch. In the solemn silence of that sacred hour, his loved voice was once more faintly heard. France, army, head of the army, Josephine, and the heart of Napoleon I ceased to beat. Isle of Elba, Napoleon, had been the last words of the loving and forgiving Josephine. France, the army, Josephine, were the last images which lingered in the heart, and the last words which trembled on the lips of the dying emperor. When the prejudice and falsehood and hatred of his enemies shall disappear, and the world can gaze impartially on this plebeian soldier, rising to the throne of an empire, measuring his single intellect with the proudest kings of Europe, and coming off victorious from the encounter, rising above the prejudices and follies of his age, making kings of plebeians and plebeians of kings, grasping, as by intuition, all military and political science, expending with equal facility his vast energies on war or peace, turning with the same profound thought from fierce battles to commerce, and trade and finances. When the world can calmly thus contemplate him, his amazing genius will receive that homage which envy and ignorance and hatred now withhold. And when the intelligent philanthropist shall understand the political and civil history of Europe, and see how Napoleon broke up its system of oppression and feudalism, proclaiming human rights in the ears of the world till the continent shook with the rising murmurs of oppressed man, study well the changes he introduced, without which human progress must have ceased. See the great public works he established, the institutions he founded, the laws he proclaimed, and the civil liberty he restored, and then, remembering that the bloody wars that offset all these were waged by him in self-defense, and were equal rights struggling against the exclusive despotism, he will regret that he has adopted the slanders of his foemen and the falsehoods of monarchists. Alexander's conquests were only for selfish glory. He cared not for his people, and little for his soldiers. Caesar's triumphs were for his own personal honor and power. The wars of Frederick the Great were nearly all unjust and aggressive, and he openly asserted his selfish ambition. But Napoleon, equaling them all in the brilliancy of his conquests, stands so far above them, as the idol of his people and his soldiers, as a man of incorruptible character in the midst of temptations as great as any which have beset mortal men, as an intellectual genius with a mind so phenomenal as to make him almost a miracle in far-seeing intuitions and marvelous accomplishment, that he must be acknowledged not only as the most famous of all the rulers of the world, but as the greatest uninspired man that ever lived. The history of most men terminates with the grave, but Napoleon's story ended not with his lonely death upon the dreary Isle of St. Helena. Each year his memory was growing brighter. Each year the French people realized more and more the irreparable loss they had sustained. The heart-melting story of his hardships at St. Helena was told over and over again in his beloved France, till at last the nation rose as one man to do his memory honor. Just 25 years from the time when Napoleon was landed, a captive upon the Isle of St. Helena, his sacred remains were brought from their humble resting place upon that rocky isle and placed in the magnificent mausoleum prepared for them in the church of the Invalides. On the anniversary of the great victory of Austerlitz, the 2 funeral frigates entered the harbor of Cherbourg. 3 ships of war, the Austerlitz, the Friedland, and the Tilsit, immediately encircled the ship which bore the sacred remains. All the forts, batteries, and warships fired a salute. All France flocked to the cities and villages through which the funeral cortege was to pass. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 14th of December, 1840, the flotilla arrived at Courbevoie, a small village 4 miles from Paris. Here the remains were to be transferred from the steamer to the shore. As the funeral barge sailed up the Seine, a colossal statue of Josephine, which had been erected on the shore, offered an appropriate and fitting welcome. Her fair form and face seemed to greet the return of her idolized husband. Maria Louisa, the daughter of the Caesars, was then living ingloriously at Parma. No one thought of her. But at last Josephine and Napoleon were united together in sacred memories on earth, as their spirits had already been reunited in heaven. A Grecian temple 100 feet high was constructed at the termination of the wharf, under which the body was to lie in state until transferred to the funeral car. Here Sergeant Hubert, who for 19 years had kept watch at the solitary grave of Napoleon at St. Helena, landed. All the generals gathered around him, and he was welcomed by the people with deep emotion. The imperial funeral car was composed of 5 distinct parts: the basement, the pedestal, the caryatides, the shields, and the cenotaph. The basement rested on 4 massive gilt wheels. It was profusely adorned with rich ornaments which were covered with frosted gold. Upon this basement stood groups of cherubs 7 feet high, supporting a pedestal 18 feet long, covered with burnished gold. This pedestal was hung with purple velvet embroidered with gold. Upon it stood 14 caryatides, antique figures larger than life, and entirely covered with gold, supporting with their heads and hands an immense shield of solid gold. This shield was of oval form and 18 feet in length, and was richly decorated. Upon the top of this shield, nearly 50 feet from the ground, was placed the cenotaph, an exact copy of Napoleon's coffin. It was slightly veiled with purple crepe embroidered with golden bees. On the cenotaph, upon a velvet cushion, were placed the scepter, the sword of justice, the imperial crown, in gold and embellished with precious stones. The church of the Invalides had been magnificently adorned for the solemn ceremony. 36,000 spectators were seated upon the immense platforms on the esplanade of the Invalides. 6,000 spectators thronged the seats of the spacious portico. In the interior of the church were assembled the clergy, the members of the chambers of deputies and of peers, and all the members of the royal family and other distinguished personages from France and Europe. As the coffin, preceded by the Prince of Joinville, was borne along the nave upon the shoulders of 32 of Napoleon's old guard, all rose and bowed in homage to the mighty dead. Louis-Philippe, surrounded by the great officers of state, then stepped forward to receive the remains. "Sire," said the prince, "I present to you the body of the Emperor Napoleon." "I receive it," replied the king, "in the name of France." Then taking from the hand of Marshal Soult the sword of Napoleon and presenting it to General Bertrand, he said, "General, I charge you to place this glorious sword of the Emperor upon his coffin." Beneath the lofty dome of the church, where the massive tomb of Napoleon has since been erected, a magnificent cenotaph in the form of a temple has been reared. Within this richly decorated catafalque, the coffin of Napoleon was reverently and solemnly placed, thus fulfilling the last wish of the emperor, expressed in these memorable words: "It is my wish that my ashes may repose on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom I have loved so well." He who united in himself alone the glory of Alexander, of Caesar, of Charlemagne, and of Louis XIV, took his place in the Invalides, which, during his life, he had marked as the place of heroes. His devoted generals Bertrand and Duroc now lie beside him. A few aged veterans of the old guard still watch over him. The sunlight, softened by the rich tints of the costly windows, falls lovingly upon his tomb, and his cherished memory lives in the hearts of his beloved people, growing more beautiful, more triumphantly venerated, and sacredly respected with each passing year. As his faithful veterans cast their crowns of flowers at the foot of his coffin with trembling voices, they lovingly though mournfully cried, "Vive l'Empereur!" And this loved emperor still lives in the hearts of his people, royally enshrined in a nation's undying love. End of Section 37, Part 3. End of The Boy's Book of Famous Rulers by Lydia Hoyt Farmer.